Thank you so much for coming to what is just going to be so amazing, and I'm just so happy to welcome these students from St. John's College, Santa Fe. So probably everybody knows me and has heard my spiel, but I'll just do a little bit. I'm Andrea Poli, Professor of Art and Computer Science at UNM, and a member of SciArt Santa Fe. We promote excellence in art science. At that intersection we call SciArt. One way we do that is by hosting lasers. Lasers are Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. They've been kind of started by the Leonardo Society for Art, Science, and Technology, and they happen all over the world in about 45 or 50 different places. So we're so excited to be the New Mexico laser host. I want to thank our great partners, Santa Fe Art Institute, and for generous support from the NEA, Mexico Arts, and from individual donors like you. Thank you so much. If you're, probably most of you are already subscribed, but if you're not, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter at sciartsantafe.org and find out about our upcoming programs. We have a whole month of programs every Saturday and Sunday. Tomorrow I am presenting with an engineer, materials engineer, Mariam Hojati, in a laser called Materials and Sustainability on Earth and Beyond. Mariam has created 3D printed dwellings that are intended to be on Mars and the Moon, and she's been experimenting with materials that would work in those places. It's pretty amazing. And on Saturday, May 17th, the wonderful Shirley Crow is going to be presenting with Marianne Hornbubble, whose work is here, and the fantastic holographer Joan Stango. So that's on next Saturday. And then next Sunday, we're going to have a laser called Flux and Feedback with Kirsten Angerbauer, who's created that work, Suiva Sevilla, who has the light boxes and the infrared piece there, and the incredible Alison Doro, who's here and is going to also do a sonic fabric demonstration at that time. So, without any further, and here's Joan, who I just mentioned. Oh yes, the star party. Thank you. So on the 23rd, 30 minutes before sunset, we are having a special laser at the Chaco Canyon Visitor Center. It's going to be with Agnes Chavez, who has an amazing project called Space Messengers, and Julia Bluebird, who is an astrophysicist. I guess if you have questions about that, you can just go and show up, and there's a star party right after that. Star party is at Chaco, all these incredible, maybe you're one of them. People bring their telescopes, and you can see just the incredible sky around Chaco, and there's a lot of information that you'll learn about that. And you can stay overnight. And if you're interested, email us at sciartsantafe@gmail, and then I can tell you about some of the things that are,
So the campsites are taken.
Yeah, there's a group campsite that's been. It's been rented, and I think that the person who rented it, I can put you in contact with. It's actually Agnes, and then I'm not sure if she's asking people to chip in or how that works.
Oh, it's
yeah.
fine.
Awesome. Yeah, it's going to be. Yeah. Paul, any questions? Oh, okay. So without any further delay, I'm so happy to introduce our Laser Talk Science and Art World in Martin Heidegger's thought. Our panel of students from St. John's College, Santa Fe, and they are Kanstantsin, Tsiarokhin, Antonio Fox, Marlo to thank Chuck Tucker for organizing this. They weren't able to make it today, but I'm going to pass on this microphone, which...
Hello. We are so grateful to be here and for you to host us all. We are from St. John's. We have 3 seniors and a sophomore, and then Marlo is a freshman. The general outline for this panel discussion is going to be kind of an overview and discussion of Heidegger's lecture and then essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. We'll be kind of going through the text sequentially and asking questions, giving details about the text. And then towards the end, we'll have some major concepts and comprehensive questions. And then hopefully we'll open it up to you all for a little bit of Q&A, and we can discuss the text and answer any questions, and maybe connect it to the exhibit as well, since we have so many beautiful pieces here. We also have provided you with a handout that has some introductory quotes, as well as some passages that we are going to analyze a little bit more in depth. And so Antonio is going to situate Heidegger's writing within philosophical history, and then we'll get started. So thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to do a brief bio of Heidegger. So he was born on September 26, 1889 in rural Meßkirch, Baden, Germany. He was initially going to train for priesthood, but he entered Jesuit seminary in 1909, but he left within weeks because of heart trouble. And he kind of started to become more interested in philosophy at that time. He also infamously was a member of the National Socialist Party, and there's a lot of interesting and important work on the connection between that and his philosophy, but we're not addressing that today. And so a little bit of the context of his philosophy, he's very interested in the history of philosophy as a whole, and he engages a lot with the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle. He writes on subjects such as language, science, art, technology, but all of these kind of subjects for him are unified by the overarching theme of ontology, so study of being, and that would certainly come up, being, existence, that will certainly come up in our discussion. And he also, I just broadly wanted to introduce an important concept to Heidegger's thought, which is that he turns to the Greeks to gain a kind of novel understanding of truth, or not necessarily novel because he's locating it in a very kind of early historical moment, but he starts to think of truth as unconcealment, and that will be something that we will discuss during this panel. And he derives that understanding of truth from the Greek word itself, which is aletheia, which is, he analyzes that etymologically to mean unconcealment, or sort of like unforgetfulness is another translation. And it's the word aletheia, if you recognize the word Leth, like the river of Leth, in which the dead were dipped in order that they would forget their whole life. So this is sort of the primitive of that. But so anyways, not to get lost in that, as was already mentioned, so this panel is the product of our collective reading of Heidegger's lecture, which was also republished as an essay, and changed and addended. So the origin of the work of art, and that lecture was drafted between 1935 and 1937, and then first published in 1950. The text is a rich exploration of the essence of artwork, which follows an unexpected route on its way to truly discovering this essence, tracing out different historical modes of thinking which impede or assist in the grasping of the artwork. Yeah, so that's just kind of a broad introduction to Heidegger's thought.
As you'll see on your handout, we have a section entitled Introductory Quotes. And these are just some quotes that we pulled from the reading that we thought sort of illustrate his way of thinking about certain subjects that are very key to what we're going to be talking about. And so I'm just going to read out to you his words. Okay. The stone is worldless. Similarly, plants and animals have no world. They belong rather to the hidden throng of an environment into which they have been put. The peasant woman, by contrast, possesses a world, since she stays in the openness of being. Quote number 2. Thus, art is the creative preservation of the truth in the work. Art is then a becoming and a happening of truth. Quote number 3. From out of the poeticizing essence of truth, it happens that an open place is thrown open, a place in which everything is other than it was. Number 4. Science, by contrast, is not an original happening of truth, but always the cultivation of a domain of truth that has already been opened up. It does this through the apprehension and confirmation of that which shows itself to be possible and necessarily correct within this sphere. If, and to the extent that a science transcends correctness and arrives at a truth, i.e., an essential disclosure of being as such, it is philosophy.
I just thought it might be important to say we have some paintings, or not necessarily just paintings, to the right of us, which are the 3 art pieces that are mentioned by Heidegger throughout the essay. And we invite you to think throughout the whole conversation and the discussion thereafter about them. So the one on the left is Vincent van Gogh's Peasant's Shoes, I believe, somewhere from mid-19th century. Then the second one you might recognize is the Greek Temple of Acropolis from Athens. And the third one is an engraving of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden by Andrea, which I believe 16th century, if I'm not mistaken. But we'll be variously referring to them throughout our conversation and invite you to keep thinking and keep looking at them all throughout.
Okay, I'm going to start by just covering the introduction to this lecture in the first section, which is entitled Thing and Work. And just circling back to Heidegger's philosophical practice, part of the way he tends to move is to start with the familiar, or that which is familiar, and move from the familiar into things that are unfamiliar, or uncanny, or strange. As was already read out in this quote, it kind of leads us to a place in which everything is other than it was. And so that's really in the beginning of this lecture that we see that movement occurring. And so the first sentence of the lecture reads, origin, and again, just to reiterate, the title is The Origin of the Work of Art. Origin means here that from where and through which a thing is, what it is, and how it is. So Heidegger is here establishing the fact that he's not looking for the origin of art in the sense of pointing to some chronological moment in history where we can say, oh, this is where art started, and just locate it simply in that way. He's looking for something that gets into the essence of artwork, and he immediately moves into a discussion of essence because the origin is the source of the, as I just read out, the whatness of the being, what it is and how it is. And so the question of origin immediately becomes a question of essence, insofar as it turns our attention towards what the thing in question actually is. So Heidegger anticipates the usual answer to that question. Artworks come from artists who make them, and he problematizes this straightforward answer by asking where in turn do artists come from. And he quickly recognizes that the status of being an artist is conferred upon the artist only by means of the artworks they create. So it is artworks that give rise to artists, rather than vice versa. And Heidegger writes, quote, the work is the origin of the artist. Neither is without the other. But even this mutually constitutive reciprocity, which occurs between the artwork and the artist, it's not adequate to sustain, they don't sustain each other. Heidegger thinks that there's still something prior to both the artwork and the artist, by virtue of which they are what they are. And this third thing that is prior, he identifies as art itself. And he immediately is sensitive to the fact that he may have aroused suspicion in the minds of those who feel that there's something metaphysically romantic or naive in this talk of art apart from the artwork or the artist. Heidegger immediately checks himself by pointing out that today art may be merely a word to which nothing real any longer corresponds. But nevertheless, the question has been revived and galvanized. What is art? Does the actuality of artworks depend upon the prior existence of some art that exists above and apart from the artist and the artwork? And if so, what would that mean? What would art be if it had an existence which precedes and grounds artists and artworks? So he kind of is wondering, is the word art just a kind of collective notion, an abstract description of a set of actual things, that is artworks and artists? Or does art signify something beyond just those actual reality of artists and artworks? And so, to reach an answer, Heidegger employs what is often described as a hermeneutic circle, and this is very common in his thinking, and he quickly tries to disabuse the readers of their reluctance to sort of engage in this circular type of thinking. He's concerned that it might be perceived as a sort of vicious cycle or just circular reasoning, but for him it's really about we can only know what an artwork is if we understand what art is in advance. Because we can only know what an artwork is if we understand art in advance, but it seems that we can only glean what art is from an examination of artworks. So there's this problem of how do I know the criterion to kind of say, well, this is an artwork. In order to identify something as artwork, I need to know what art is. But Heidegger is also recognizing that in order to know what art is, I need to go and look at the artworks. So he wants to engage in a sort of circle which goes back and forth between the two of these and reveals either harmony or discord and kind of proceeds according to the what it reveals in moving back and forth between them. And so Heidegger opts to begin by considering the immediate actuality of the artwork. That is, he recognizes this stance as intuitive. And quote, if we consider the works in their untouched actuality and do not deceive ourselves, the result is that the works are as naturally present as are things. The picture hangs on the wall like a rifle or a hat, end quote. So Heidegger is recognizing that the artwork has a sort of physical reality that it presents itself immediately. And Heidegger thinks that this would be a good place to start because it bypasses any sort of obscure ways of approaching art that already presuppose some sort of definition of the work of art in advance, and it allows us just to approach something like the things themselves, the physical objects in which reside the art. But it's not so simple because this immediately leads Heidegger to ask, what is the truth of a thing? How do we understand what a thing is? So in the example that I read, the quotation, he talks about how a picture hangs on the wall like a rifle or a hat. Those are both things. But how do we understand things? And this is where Heidegger's ontological preoccupation comes to the fore. And as a result of what he thinks of as the destiny of history, determined by the fate of Western thought, thinghood or thingness emerges as the traditional criterion for beings to be qualified as beings, but thinghood admits of different interpretations. And Heidegger enumerates 3 ways of understanding thinghood, or understanding what a thing is, which present themselves to us immediately out of the tradition of Western thinking and are really just embedded in our language. And it's hard to avoid them. We have to kind of actively do work in order to avoid these interpretations of a thing that foist themselves upon us. And so I think I'm just gonna move, for time's sake, I'm going to skip the first 2 interpretations of the thing and skip to the 3rd one, which is most pertinent. Well, Heidegger just considers a couple different interpretations of the thing, which he locates as kind of coming to us from Western thought in Greece, in ancient Greece. But the final one that seems to be most insistently asserting itself in discussions of art or in discussions of things in general is the interpretation of things as equipment. And this becomes sort of paradigmatic for interpreting artwork and just beings in general. And part of that, what we learn is that the equipmental interpretation of things resolves itself into a pair of concepts, which is matter and form. And this is probably familiar. Heidegger identifies it as kind of at the heart of aesthetics, the field in which we sort of try to approach works of art and evaluate and understand them. It makes use of this pair of concepts often of form and context. So we have the materials out of which a thing is made and the form, the shape which it takes. And this is a way to understand art or artworks. But so Heidegger, and this is maybe not immediately evident why equipment would yield, the interpretation of things as equipment would yield this matter-form pair of concepts. And basically, for Heidegger, it has to do with the usefulness of equipment. So I'm going to read a quote. As Heidegger writes, quote, "The interfusion of form and matter prevailing here is moreover controlled beforehand by the purposes served by jug, axe, shoes," end quote. So jug, axe, and shoes, those are 3 examples of things that are equipmental or kind of exemplars of equipmental things. And Heidegger is basically saying that beforehand, all of these things and the way we experience them, understand them, and interact with them is determined by purposes. And the purposes determine the form that we're going to employ and the matter that we're going to employ. So there's a certain form that is conducive for a hammer, and there's also a certain material that is conducive for a hammer, something harder and stronger. And so use and purpose end up sort of defining this recognition of things as being resolved into both matter and form. All of these different interpretations of things, which are also interpretations of beings, are problematic for Heidegger. I skipped the first 2 and just went to the 3rd one, but they all are preconceptions, and these preconceptions shackle reflection on the being of any given thing. And he after tracing the path of these different interpretations, which all fail to capture the essence of the thing, Heidegger wonders if part of the essence of thinghood involves as an essential component this evasiveness. So this sort of being self-contained and withdrawn, and maybe these attempts to sort of capture what it is to be a thing with matter and form. Another example is to think of it as a sort of bundle of sensations, which in the subject kind of come together into a unified whole. But all of these different interpretations do violence to the thing. They don't let it show itself to us as it might be in itself. They sort of presuppose what it has to be. And so Heidegger's wondering if maybe the nature of the thing is such that it constantly conceals itself, because that would make sense for why there's been so many problems with the interpretations. And he also is curious why the equipmental interpretation of things attains such preeminence. And why do we interpret all things in terms of equipment. I mean, that's a claim he makes that we can wonder about the validity of. But why do we interpret things in terms of equipment? And here this hermeneutic circle loops back onto itself, and we try to understand equipment. So initially we were trying to understand equipment in order that we might understand things, in order that we might understand an artwork, in order that we might understand the essence of art. But now we're going to turn to a particular artwork in order that we might understand the essence of equipment and its relation to art. So we're kind of going to circle back into artwork and the shoe. So this is when we're going to come to the shoes by Van Gogh. And Heidegger decides that he wants to kind of consider a piece of equipment in a very unphilosophical way. He just wants to let it present itself to us without presupposing any rigid interpretation of what it must be. But in order to understand the shoes as equipment, he turns to an artwork which visually depicts a pair of shoes, and this is Shoes by Van Gogh. And so let's consider why he turns to this artwork. Heidegger points out that equipment is what it is when it's in use. Shoes are what they are when they're in use, when you're wearing them and walking around in them. But in use, the shoes disappear as objects of consideration or contemplation. So the equipmental character of the shoes is encountered most genuinely when they are forgotten and inconspicuous in their use. So if I was aware of my shoes right now, because they were bothering me if they're too tight, or something was calling my attention to them, they would not be serving their purpose as shoes. They would be somehow not what they're supposed to be or what they are. So they must be invisible in their usage for them to remain useful. As soon as they become conspicuous, they're not really what they are. And if they begin to become an obtrusive object of attention, then they can no longer serve their purpose. But we want to understand what we might describe as the equipmentality of equipment. So if equipment is what it is only in usage, why does Heidegger turn to a painting in which the shoes stand by themselves, isolated from their proper world of usage? The shoes seem to emerge out of nothing. And this is, I'm about to kind of turn to a quote in our passages for analysis, number 5. But yeah, the shoes seem to emerge out of nothing. As you can see, there's nothing else besides them, just alone and isolated. And so how does the painting reveal the equipmental quality of the shoes? Heidegger acknowledges that the shoes seem to lack a sense of belonging to their space, which is undefined, but it is precisely this lack of definition which Heidegger suggests allows the interrelated context of the shoes to emerge in all of its truth. So this lack of definition, this nothingness in which we find the shoes, allows the world to which they correspond to come into focus for the first time. And so I'm just going to read this passage from Heidegger and see how he feels about this painting. He's, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, he's decided that the shoes belong to a peasant woman. Well, it just shoes. But okay, there is nothing surrounding this pair of peasant shoes to which and within which they could belong. Only an undefined space. Sorry, this is the quotation. Not even clods of earth from the field or from the country path stick to them, which could at least point toward their use. A pair of peasant shoes and nothing more. And yet, from out of the dark opening of the well-worn insides of the shoes, the toil of the worker's tread stares forth. In the crudely solid heaviness of the shoes accumulates the tenacity of the slow trudge through the far-stretching and ever-uniform furrows of the field-swept by a raw wind. On the leather lies the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the sole slides the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. Those shoes vibrate with the silent call of the earth, its silent gift of the ripening grain, its unexplained self-refusal in the wintry field. This equipment is pervaded by uncomplaining worry as to the certainty of bread, wordless joy at having once more withstood want, trembling before the impending birth, and shivering at the surrounding menace of death. This equipment belongs to the earth and finds protection in the world of the peasant woman. From out of this protected belonging, the equipment itself rises to resting within itself. And so just to briefly do an analysis of that passage, we see a lot of things brought to the fore that will become important later on in this paper, but just to focus on the most important is that, so at the end of that passage we have something resting within itself, and Heidegger is going to come to understand this resting within itself as reliability, that the shoes are reliably there. And this reliability has to do with the relation to the earth, which is exposed by the usage of equipment as revealed through this artwork. The equipment stands at the brink between world and earth. The soil and its natural tendencies are brought under the ordering of the world of the peasant woman. The quiet gift can be seen as the hiddenness of material of the earth, which is concealing, and which is brought forth and protected within the world of the peasant. The pair of shoes implicitly brings to light all of the struggle and also joy which the peasant woman faces in straddling the rift between world and earth. The artwork reveals all this by allowing an open space for this relationship between world and earth to emerge. These concepts, world and earth, will become increasingly important in subsequent sections. And yeah, just to wrap this up, so this section, at least the beginning section, we have something curious just happened in Heidegger's turning to this painting, which is that he wanted to discover the essence of equipment, but in doing so, he also discovered inadvertently some kind of aspect of art, or of the work being of an artwork, is how he describes it. And we discovered the equipmental quality of equipment not by description and explanation of an actual pair of shoes, but only by bringing ourselves before Van Gogh's painting. Quote, "This painting spoke. In the nearness of the work, we were suddenly somewhere else than we usually tend to be. The artwork lets us know what shoes are in truth." Excuse me, end quote. So the artwork lets us know what shoes are in truth. And this introduces the next section, which Heidegger will start to kind of consider, what would it mean for an artwork to let us know what things are in truth? What would it mean for art to have that capacity?
The second section of the essay is entitled The Work and Truth, where Heidegger introduces a complication. So we can no longer discover something about the thing, the aspect of the work, until the pure, quote, standing in itself, unquote, of the work has clearly shown itself. So we need to understand what art is when it kind of is self-subsisting, when it stands alone as art, in order to understand it as a thingly, or having a thingly character. The thingly character has only been understood in a preconceived framework, such as kind of like high art or the art market, or even in science. We aim to understand what things are in science, or other interpretations. But the thingly character of the artwork is hidden from us without understanding in what way the work is a thing. So we need to pursue this kind of standing in itself-ness of the work. But then it comes to the question, how do we let the work stand on its own? In order to put the artwork into its own motion, to act as the artwork, this is kind of the intention of the artist, in order to let the artwork be its own thing. They kind of act as a passageway through which the art arises as its own thing and is able to stand by itself, kind of like a midwife for the artwork. Standing in itself, he describes as a happening, kind of an event that occurs. Almost in poetry, how when you have the first line of a poem in a certain meter with a certain rhyme, the rest of the poem kind of lays itself out for you. You're forced to continue in a certain way based on, the frame that you're constructing the poem within, which he describes as a happening.
Building off of that, he says that it's important that an artwork must not be removed from its essential space, because this removal withdraws, it takes the artwork away from its world. the artwork, he says, a good artwork should be a standalone piece sort of in itself. So how can it at once be in relation to things but standing on its own? Because this idea that it just sort of comes through the artist is not somehow in relation to the artist. It comes through, and he says that he asks, does the work remain a work when it stands outside all relations? Does it not belong to the work to stand in relation? In answer to that, he says that yes, it does. It is a necessary component of the artwork that it stands in relation, but the relation that it stands in is perhaps the more important question. Then here's where he sort of views the artwork as a somewhat self-contained thing. For as a work, it belongs in relation to and within the world that it itself opens up. This opening up and then being within is characteristic of his view of art, because it at once brings forth and opens up something to be seen that was not previously visible, while also simultaneously embracing containment and concealment. So in other words, this duality of artwork, opening up and also being within, is somehow essential to its nature. This duality is, in his view, truth. Earlier, there was a description of how he views truth based off the Greek word for truth, and the way that he interprets that is that the unconcealing aspect of truth is that it is integral for it to be concealed as well as revealed, somehow simultaneously. It's not an act of unconcealing that removes itself from being concealed, but they have to be somehow in conversation with each other the whole time. So in order to demonstrate how he sees artwork being the happening of this type of truth, he uses the example of a Greek temple. This temple that he uses this, he says, because it's entirely non-representational. And a fundamental aspect of the temple is that it contains a God within it, while also being a place where this God is able to become present. So once again, the concealing within and the bringing forth are happening at the same time and are an integral part of what makes this temple artwork. So the temple, for this position that it conceals and reveals, it functions to contextualize the experiences and lives of the humans that interact with it and who create it. And this sort of act of contextualization is, he says, a fundamental aspect of what artwork does and is part of that truth revealing and unconcealing web. It's so fundamental that it even extends to the surrounding landscape that the temple interacts with. And it's very interesting that here Heidegger's reasoning takes on a very visual quality. And he describes the way that the presence of the temple brings forth the surrounding area due to the juxtaposition that it has with the terrain around it. And I think you can see this if you look at the image of the temple as just a visual image, that you know that the sky behind it is a sky because you can tell that it's not the temple, and the same with the ground. And somehow this contrast of elements is a way in which the temple itself is sort of bringing forth the sky and the earth and the people and snakes and creatures around it. So the quality of something rests on the fact that it is not the same as the other things next to it. And this juxtaposition is in itself an act of bringing forth. Now, Heidegger calls the thing that is brought forth earth. And as was earlier touched on, he has a very different understanding of earth than what we might at first think. And he's very careful to make it known that he doesn't mean just dirt, and he doesn't mean the planet Earth. He says that earth is that in which the arising of everything that arises is brought back and sheltered. So for him, earth is fundamentally a concealing thing, and artworks have to be built on earth, on this concealment, in order for there to be an unconcealing truth in them. But since that is sort of the nature of artwork, is to bring forth this concealed, then Heidegger says that artworks necessarily open up a world, which is once again another word that he describes differently from what we at first think. And it should not be confused with our regular understanding of world. By the opening of a world, he says, all things gain their lingering and hastening, their distances and proximity, their breadth and their limits. So this opening of world seems very in keeping with what he said earlier about how the temple acts as something that contextualizes its surroundings, because you know how things are based on their relationship to their proximity, their size, their shape in relation to the temple. And it seems that this definition of distance and proximity, it is in itself sort of a kind of opening up and revealing, which is then contrasted against the closed nature of the earth, that is this concealing nature that is the very thing that is sort of brought forth in the temple and around the temple. The very material that the artwork is an example of earth present in the artwork. And he says, unlike equipment, this artwork does not use up the material that is formed from, but only uses it. And this distinction is sort of an interesting one to consider, and especially I think in an exhibition like this where there's so many artworks here that are very fundamentally tied to the material that makes them, which I think is true of I think all artwork. But he says here that the material is not separate from the work, and therefore the material is not simply used up in order to fulfill the end goal, which would be the case for equipment, where the sort of the use of the equipment and the material used are sort of separate things, because you need to use this material in order to accomplish this goal with the equipment, whereas artwork, somehow the material is itself a part of the goal and is not for the sake of the goal. Earth, he says, is that which cannot be forced. This concealing nature of it cannot be forced, and when one tries to open it or look at it, it always will retreat further. For instance, if you break open a rock to see what's inside it, there's always going to be other parts of the rock that you can't see. There's always sort of a concealed nature to the rock. You can't just force it to open and show you what's inside it. But this is not the case in a work of art. Somehow, by making a work of art out of the material is instead brought forth as integral and a part of the work itself, and not as a means to something. Because the material is by nature something that wishes to conceal, being an earth, this bringing forth of something that is in its nature concealing is where that creation of the contrast between concealing and bringing forth, where it arises in artwork, and therefore brings forth this unconcealing form of truth. And Heidegger characterizes this as a form of strife that is integral to truth of an artwork.
Yeah, so as Clara was just mentioning, the artwork establishes both a world and sets forth the earth. As she was saying, the world is a self-opening openness, of kind of broad paths. I can see this exists. And earth is the self-secluding, sheltering thing which resists full disclosure. There's a small quote I'm going to read. Quote, world and earth are essentially different and yet never separated from one another. World is grounded on earth, and earth rises up through world. So they resist each other, but at the same time affirm each other in their resisting, in this kind of dynamic tension. And he says that art arises in the strife between world and earth, and this strife is essential for the happening of truth, as he sees it. I'm going to read the sixth quote? Yes, the sixth quote, and do a little analysis of this. So, quote, the opposition of world and earth is strife. We would, to be sure, all too easily falsify the essence of the strife were we to conflate that essence with discord and dispute, and know it, therefore, only as disruption and destruction. In essential strife, however, the opponents raise each other into the self-assertion of their essences. This self-assertion of essence is, however, never a rigid fixation on some condition that happens to be the case, but rather a surrendering into the hidden originality source of one's own being. In the struggle, each opponent carries the other beyond itself. As a consequence, the strife becomes ever more intense as striving, and ever more authentically what it is. The more intransigently the strife outdoes itself on its own part, the more uncompromisingly do the opponents admit themselves into the intimacy of their simple belonging to each other, to one another. The earth cannot do without the openness of world if it is to appear in the liberating surge of its self-closedness. World, on the other hand, cannot float away from the earth if, as the prevailing breath and path of all essential destiny, is to ground itself on something decisive. So, I'm reading in this that Heidegger's account of strife isn't suggestive of opposition or about rupture. It's a rift where something begins to emerge. Strife, in this sense, is not a disruption, but a creation, an event, a happening. It's the moment when world and earth don't simply sit alongside one another, but actually press up against each other in a way that forces each to reveal more of itself. In this tension, Heidegger says, each is carried beyond itself. There's a kind of drama here, almost a Hegelian tension between assertion and negation, which resolves into synthesis. It is a dynamic surpassing where being asserts itself, not by standing still, but by being drawn out through the friction which threatens it, through the opposition. That world opposes earth, or earth opposes world, and yet strife is drawn out. The essential natures of these things is drawn out through their tension. This is the moment of decision, or even of creation, such as a sudden clarity that arises at the edge of uncertainty, or the way something new appears only when we stay inside a contradiction, such as two voices in counterpart, or light which is only visible in contrast to shadow. Heidegger calls this self-assertion not a grasping or a fixing, but a surrender into the hidden source of one's own being. Here's the paradox. The more intensely the tension unfolds, the more the opponents, world and earth, belong to each other. It is in this belonging that something like truth or a work of art arises. The artwork arises not through resolution, but as a fierce elemental belonging. Artwork depends on this strife and the constant striving against earth and world against earth. in order to reach a peak of simplicity and unity in the work. The simple intimacy Heidegger calls repose is this moment where you're first able to see what is at work in the work. So if it is only by remaining in the rift, at the edge of clarity and concealment, that we actually, is it only in this, by remaining in the rift, that we can make something real? In other words, how out of concealment and unconcealment does something real, something truthful arise? What kind of truth is born out of strife? One that holds together difference without collapsing into the tension. And what would it mean to live in such a truth where simple belonging is tension? It is at this moment where Heidegger introduces truth in the artwork. He says, quote, "In what way does truth happen in the artwork? I.e., how, in what way does truth happen in the fighting of the fight between the world and earth," unquote. I have a number of questions about what simple belonging he mentions is, and the kind of unity that draws out of strife. What is the tension? What is this belonging to each other that's so dramatically emphasized in world and earth? And then in a creative moment where rift is kind of born and our work begins to flow forth truth. And moving into the next section, truth occurs in the work only if it's founded on setting the work into truth, or the setting into work of truth, the preservation of the work through people who respond to it, people who go to galleries, people who engage in artwork, and then the creators or conservators of art who engage with the work and ground the historical being of the people.
Yeah, so in this section that Sophie was just talking about, the third section of Heidegger's essay, Truth and Art, Heidegger is to explore the relationship between truth and art and how we find each. To him, the work's becoming a work is a mode of the becoming and happening of truth. We are to understand that the artist is actively bringing forth the truth of beings. It is thus in this creation of a work that the strife is present, in which the conflict offers some repose. This becomes a confrontation, as truth is present only as the strife between clearing and concealing and the opposition between world and earth. Still, truth and art are not synonymous. As art, the origin of work, requires creation and preservation. Heidegger defines this preservation as standing within the openness of beings that happens in work. By this reasoning, art preserves the truth of work, and art is then a becoming and happening of truth. It is here that the distinction between art and science is drawn. While both are related to truth, science is the cultivation of a domain of truth that has already been opened, while art is the becoming and happening of truth. Does this imply that we must have art before we have science? Next, I'll look at these three pieces. If it is, as Heidegger says, and all art is in essence poetry, how do we understand true art? Van Gogh's Peasant Shoes and the Greek Temple, as referred to earlier and depicted here, appear to fit this mold for Heidegger. In both of these works, there appears to be a distinct linkage between earth and world. The shoes are depicted as grounded on what represents earth and are absence of their owner, who often defines the shoes themselves. The temple is, as a work, physically grounded on earth, the world standing atop the earth which contains it. In this section of the essay, Heidegger refers to Dürer, but doesn't choose a distinct piece. So I decided the etching of Heidegger, of Dürer's piece, Adam and Eve. I'm wondering if Dürer's Adam and Eve would fit this mold. The familiar figures emerge from a similarly weighted forest nude. Their bodies are frontal and stand in a classic contrapposto where their position of their hips and shoulders create the illusion of movement and rest. Their natural state is clashed by their heads, which are turned to the side to gaze at one another stiffly, not hiding their body out of shame. They are pictured in a paradise of thick woodland, which conceals the complex relation of nature and human ambition. Does the inclusion of the human figure disrupt the becoming and happening of truth, present in art, or make it ever present? Perhaps it is in each of these pieces that man is implied. Man utilizing shoes as equipment, man having founded the temple for the god, and man present in nature. Through Heidegger's thought, am I to understand that in a work of art, truth lets itself be set into work, or truth is fixed into the work of art? Are these in contradiction?
Yeah, so I'll make some maybe remarks about that section and about the essay as a whole, as a view in relation to how Heidegger understands encountering art proper. So in this section, Heidegger shifts to the notion of truth as an agent, in a way. That the truth is that which acts through a human being, instead of truth in some way being conjured up in some poetical inspiration, completely from within one's human subjectivity. In that way, Heidegger shifts to the moment of the artwork beginning to take place, not artwork as already completed, finished, done, where nothing else is to be discovered and nothing else is to be gained from. I'll read a small quote from the handout. It's quote 7, I believe. It's Heidegger commenting on the strife. Yeah. The strife is not resolved in something brought forth specifically for the purpose, but neither is it merely housed there. The strife is rather opened up by the work. This being must therefore contain within itself the essential traits of the strife. In the strife, the unity of world and earth is one. As the world opens itself up, puts up for decision the historical humanity, the question of victory or defeat, blessing and curse, lordship and slavery, the dawning world brings to the fore that which is still undecided and without measure and decisiveness. So something important to point out here is that Heidegger doesn't consider work of art as some kind of eternal presence or timeless presence. For him, the work of art is present in history, in time, to us as historical beings present in this particular instant, which will never be repeated in the future and was never before in the past, and in this way possesses a kind of exceptional status. Therefore, encountering the work of art, one should encounter it with one's whole being. In some way, one should, as Heidegger says in the essay, be put under question by the work of art, instead of maybe allowing oneself to quibble with the work of art or find problem with it, or maybe to just pass over it as something accepted as wonderful, beautiful, and great. Heidegger is concerned with how this comes about, and he's interested in opening it up to the degree possible. For him, the world that opens up in this kind of rift between earth and world, in other words, between the concealedness and unconcealedness, is not, as he says, a mere cleft. Rather, it is the intimacy of the mutual dependence of the contestants. In this way, I think, looking at these artworks, you can see how something is being revealed, something is being promised by the works of art. And they're inviting, I think, truly great works of art, the works of art that deserve its name, invite someone who encounters them into thinking about itself. In this way, the work of art is neither a kind of scientific statement that's simply concerned with unconcealing and making clear, nor is it something completely obscure that only conceals and promises no further clarity. Work of art in this way occupies this place of the rift between concealedness and unconcealedness, and invites someone who faces it into an appropriate kind of struggle. I'll read the last quote, number 8 on the handout. Heidegger there says, "The strife which is brought into the rift design, and so set back into the earth and fixed in place, is a figure." Gestalt. The createdness of the work means the fixing in place of truth in the figure. Figure is the structure of the rift in its self-establishment. We should maybe tolerate Heidegger's kind of obscurity here. I think, especially the Duré work of art, the engraving of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, offers an interesting perspective onto what has been said in quote 8, insofar as engraving is fundamentally a sketch. It is fundamentally an outline and not a colored, fully painted work of art, as many works of art we can witness in this museum, or even Van Gogh's shoes. It seems to me that Heidegger is pointing out that the rift, in order for it to provide repose and for it to be sustained as a tension between the concealedness and unconcealedness, the rift has to be properly structured. Here it's structured as a sketch. Sketch can take various forms. It can take form of a visual sketch, it seems to me. It can take form of a rhythm, of poetic rhyme. Nevertheless, it offers a degree of structure that helps one facing the work of art properly engage with it in the struggle between concealedness and unconcealedness. For Heidegger, work of art is nothing that provides ultimate transparency or clarity. As he says at one point, quote, "The task is to seize the enigma." That is to say, the interest for him, as someone who encounters art, is not to provide some exhaustive description of it, as maybe the study of aesthetics would do, or pretend one has provided one. The interest is rather to encounter the work of art with one's whole being in a way that would provide something new and original of that moment of encounter, and appropriate it into one's being. In this way, we should be confronted by the work of art, being pulled into it by a certain question, and endure that original experience through thinking. Heidegger concludes the whole essay by saying that what sustains art is even a possible phenomenon. You could imagine a world where art maybe is not present. Yet we're in a world where it is present in various ways, sometimes in more concealed, sometimes in less concealed ways, and various peoples engage with it differently. He seems to say, I would say, clearly that the phenomenon of art is sustained by the fact that saying and being belong together. That is to say, the being of the work of art and language can have in our world some fundamental affinity. And the work of art, the being of the work of art, in its mysteriousness and enigmatic capacity, can be expressed in language. That language, however, for Heidegger doesn't take form of scientific language, as we're used to think about it, or aesthetic language of some sort. It takes shape of original thinking. For example, we could think back to how Antonio talked about his encounter with the Van Gogh's shoes, where the being of the work of art, shoes, isolated from its appropriate context of being used. Shoes are basically presented as useless in that picture, not being used at that moment. That encounter presents a receiver of the work of art with an ample opportunity, perhaps a hard one and a difficult one, of engaging one's thinking in it. Let me read one more quote that's perhaps not on the handout. It's at some point in the essay, Heidegger talks about what is the solitary encounter with the work of art. I think it's also essential that the encounter is primarily solitary, insofar as it bespeaks one's being as an individual, as a person, and not as some kind of collective. So he says, quote, "The more solitary the work fixed in the figure stands within itself, the more purely it seems to sever all ties to human beings. Then the more simply does the thrust that such a work is step into the open, and the more essentially, the extraordinary is thrust to the surface, and the long familiar is thrust down. Yet there is nothing violent about this multidirectional thrust, for the more purely is the work itself transported into the openness of beings it itself opens up, then the more simply does it carry us into this openness, and at the same time out of the realm of the usual. We circle back to the Antonio's claim of beginning from the familiar and leaping into the unfamiliar. This kind of leap seems to only be possible through the work of art, which offers us, if we encounter it appropriately and thoughtfully, a completely novel world, the world of the complete otherness. To keep reading, to submit to this displacement means to transform all familiar relations to world and to earth, and henceforth to restrain all usual doing and prizing, knowing and looking, in order to dwell within the truth that is happening in the work. The restraint of this dwelling allows what is created to become for the first time the work that it is. This seems to me crucial. The work of art appropriately invites us into a complete otherness that could be only encountered by us in this particular moment. Heidegger, closer to the end of the essay, as an author that writes in the beginning of modern period, he writes this essay at the beginning of the 20th century, almost 100 years ago. He's concerned with this ubiquitous phenomenon that I think all of us can testify to in various degrees, namely the phenomenon of the fact that art, great art, seems to somehow not be present in our world. It's a thing of the past. People are not anymore captivated by it, people don't recognize it as great, people do not encounter it in their lives, it doesn't play some kind of important role. Heidegger is concerned with that, and he thinks that it is a real possibility that art might be gone from our world, great art. Yet he seems to say that for us to decide on this question would only be possible if we were to encounter art thoughtfully. That is to say, he associates this phenomenon of absence of great works of art with what he calls fear of thinking. And I think there is something real to that phenomenon, insofar as we as people in 21st century and 20th century perhaps to some extent seem to accept the notion that certain works are great, and which therefore prevents our authentic encounter with those works as not being covered up by layers of reception of that work of art as great. That is to say, in order to really open up the work of art, and in order to submit to it as something that offers us ample enrichment and ample opportunities for thought and being in a novel way, we have to encounter works of art in complete isolation from the tradition of its reception, it seems to me, from opinions of others, and from anything else that might have been produced and passed down onto us from the past. In this way, Heidegger is a real thinker of original encounter, of an encounter with a work of art that truly can be life-changing and definitive for a being. Perhaps I would end here with this very provocative and maybe remarks full of pathos. It's kind of inappropriate. But we could maybe receive a couple of questions if people have any. Please, and maybe we can share your microphones.
First, I have a comment and then I have a question. So, first of all, I want to thank you for, on a Saturday night, asking me to delve into Heidegger's definition of being and truth. So, thank you very much. So, my question is, do you have any opinions, speculations, or comments on whether Warhol has either extended, is extinguished, or is outside of Heidegger's view on art? That wasn't acceptable.
I
No, that's fine.
think
Okay, it's on. Warhol to Heidegger, to compare the two, this is a difficult question.
Well, let me maybe extend the definition, but the proposition is, as I understand it, is that the history of art has been primarily a definition of what is art and what is not art. And as we know, not that long ago, there was long discussions on whether impressionistic art was art, whether photography was art, whether AI was art. So the proposition that in 1954, Warhol's Relevant answered the question, which was everything is art. Right, so it's the end of art. Just as John Cage did the same thing with music. It was 4:58, right? Everything is music. So just to clarify the question.
Yeah, no, the Dadaist sentiment, I don't think Heidegger would agree with. Dadaism, for those of you who don't know, is that everything is art common. For Heidegger, the world seems individual, that it has to be itself, and like the truth of the art happens in its creation. And so for Warhol, who's reproducing images, or for AI, for example, which is taking pre-existing art and then amalgamating it together, I believe Heidegger wouldn't call that true art, because it's the reproduction of already existing images, of already existing art, and repurposing it and reconstructing it in some way that may turn the world on its head, in a sense, may shift it, but is not its own world. I'm not sure if you guys had any other comments on that.
I'm thinking of John Cage, 438, 33, something. I don't know. I mean, I guess, yeah, within the context of this essay, I think the context of the artwork is especially important. That silence in an auditorium would not kind of be so emphatic if it were not presented in the way that John Cage presented it. Especially kind of releasing an album of, like, here's my record of silence, or like a silent auditorium. But I wonder, I mean, to what degree the context of an auditorium, removed from the context that we normally be presented in, actually emphasizes something even more particular about the silence. That I'm trying to kind of like connect this to the concealment and the unconcealment as well, with the rift, but also just kind of where do we notice things most? Where do we notice presences most? It's actually outside of the context that we normally find it in. And in that, I feel like John Cage's 4 minutes, 30-something seconds would actually emphasize something maybe even more groundbreaking than we might expect it to. Similar with Warhol's kind of like recontextualizing the tomato plants. Yeah. But even like the Warhol, the images he produced of Campbell's soup or something like this, like, I think the dramatic shift in context actually does serve Heidegger's purpose as a definition of art.
Yeah, I think I could interact with the John Cage, the 433, a little bit easier than the Warhol, but like you said, it's not necessarily silence, because what is actually revealed in that silence, or that nothingness, which is kind of maybe how Heidegger would like to think of it, is you hear people breathing and coughing and sneezing and blowing, like all of these things are brought to the fore that would be concealed otherwise over the course of the performance, were there actual music being played. And so I think, yeah, it does fit with this idea of sort of like pulling something out of its context in order to reveal a new aspect of it.
Yeah, and just
sort of to touch on this idea of like the recontextualization in relation to like repurposing something. I feel like there is something about repurposing like, and sort of a photograph that is very much in keeping with that idea of like somehow unconcealing this thing that is concealed. You need to have that thing itself in conversation. And so I think that idea of Heidegger's, I feel like, is very ties very well with some more like contemporary and more modern art techniques or views, I guess, that are about the sort of the material speaking for itself, rather than, and even if that message is sort of a confusion about what art is, that still, I think, is revealing somehow something about the people who interact with that thing.
COVID times, but also at this piece right here. But yeah, like this piece in the back with these different kind of like spaces conjoined together in a sort of jarring way, and the signs especially are kind of what I was drawn to in thinking about it in a Heideggerian way, and that these signs they're placed in such a way where their context is completely absent, and there's something is revealed about the sort of the equivalmentality of signs. I mean, the way we interact with the sign is like direct me, slow down, go this way. But here it's as if the things that were meant to direct us only serve to sort of reveal the directionlessness that we're currently facing. And yeah, I don't know if you have something to say.
Natalie Christensen and Jim Mayer.
I mean, I think even earlier we were just talking about like the door has no doorknob, there are corners that go nowhere, and these are kind of places that are concealed within the art, at the same time drawing forth and like emphasizing, I think, that this is a collage image. It's an image of many images, and I like this piece especially, and even this one. I feel like the very earthly matter as well, situated. It's kind of like, you know, almost a greenhouse atmosphere.
World and
Earth. World and Earth.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
I have a sort of comment. First of all, thanks you guys. You did an amazing job of taking something really like I Ching, you know, Heidegger's pretty dense. I feel like if we could replace a couple of Heidegger's words with other words, it would really make a lot more sense. Like, for example, instead of saying that there's a dualism between concealed and revealed, if we said that there was a dialectic. I think when we say dialectic or paradox or something like that, all of a sudden we can know in our souls like what that feels like. Like, oh yeah, so much of our world is opposites and paradoxes, and I think, you know, ever since Descartes, we've been told to make things, you know, to have dualism. And I think if we can undo dualism, we can get a far way. You know, we can start to understand a lot more things. It's not just art, or it's not just science. It can be both of those things. So we don't even need to ask the question which thing happened first, because both of those things did emerge from a human being curious about the world. I mean, a scientist has the same, you know, that is a dialectic too, taking something out of the unknown and into the known. And I think artists are doing that, taking something out of the known and making a tangible artifact. I like the word philosopop, because I think a lot of these pieces are philosopops. They're works that are designed to demonstrate a concept or make you think about something in a new way, or a theory. You know, so maybe an artist is working on a theory. So I like the word philosopop. But anyway, I really appreciate it. It was a lot of great food for thought. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm curious about your suggestion in terms of the dialectics. I wonder if what we are perceiving behind that word is a kind of promise of utter clarity. Like the fact that things are dialectically related means that there is sort of a sublime resolution of all contradictions, or sublime kind of clarity about things. That once we relate everything to everything, or one pair of opposites to another, things suddenly manifest themselves as resolved and clear. I think in that way, Heidegger's weird language, I mean, I think it's appropriately frustrating and appropriately annoying. Like, it's very annoying to me, at least, to read him and to try to explain him to myself even. I think it's appropriately annoying because it really makes you, I think it makes you aware, poetically, of a kind of mysterious nature that he's trying to bespeak. That the object of thought which he encounters is truly dim. And it requires dim language for that reason to be employed. And to me it seems the works of art for him are somewhat distinct from some kind of philosophical theory, insofar as in producing the philosophical theory, discovering the philosophical theory, outlining it, a philosopher seeks to be, for that idea to be understood, it seems to me. It seems to me his understanding of works of art is a bit more open-ended and unpredictable. It seems to me in his conception of things, the creator, the artist, might not understand very well what he is doing. And that might endow the work of art with a certain quality, with a certain mysterious open-ended quality that will then be expressed in infinite number of encounters with that work of art by very different people in very different situations. It seems to me if we were to reduce the work of art to some kind of concept or idea that could be expressed, that would in a way make the works of art irrelevant once once it is encountered by one person. And the work of art could perhaps be discarded or burned down after that in some way.
Yes, please. I'm also worried about, you pointed out my question and you were like, do we have to ask which comes first? To Heidegger, science is in contrast to art. It's in our introductory quotes that science, by contrast, is not an original happening of truth, which is art, but always the cultivation of a domain of truth, which makes it so that the two can't be conflated together. That's my only concern with pointing the two as such.
And yet, I do think that Heidegger would recognize, I agree with what you just said, and I think that Heidegger maintains the sort of the difference between the type of revealing that happens in art and the type of revealing that happens in science. And in fact, I mean, to your point, I think Heidegger is really concerned with a sort of, if I can use this word, mysterious aspect of art that cannot be just explicitly translated into this is the concept they were trying to get across, but remains undefinable in that way. But I think Heidegger would recognize a work of art that incorporates the scientific world in it, and in such a way reveals that world artistically, not as that the world that art would be concerned with in that case would be the world of science. But that wouldn't make it science and art working in tandem. That would make it art working to reveal science, is the way I would kind of think of that. And science may have a more exhaustive tendency towards clarity and just laying everything bare. Leave no obscurity, leave no concealment. But art may preserve some of this concealment as an essential part of it.
Would you say physics does that as well? Because, for example, quantum physics and classical physics, there are two separate physics that are simultaneously existing right now. All of us are made up of quantum particles that behave according to entirely different laws than the laws of the large. So I don't know, maybe physics wouldn't work for Heidegger, but physics didn't exist, really. I mean, quantum physics didn't exist, so maybe you wouldn't know. To me, science, the difference between science and art is science, you have to be objective. You have to imagine yourself as being a completely separate entity from the thing, and you have to create control groups to make sure that you are separate. As an artist, you don't have to abide by those rules. So you can totally be one with the thing. You can merge with the shoe. And that's how Van Gogh probably did that. I mean, he looked at the shoe for so long that he related to the shoe. And then part of himself got into that painting. So, I have some arguments with him. Aside from the fact that he was a Nazi, which I'm glad he pointed out.
I just wanted to quickly speak on earlier the suggestion that couldn't you find easier terms to replace what he's saying because it's really confusing. And I agree with that, but also I wonder if there's something about that nature of confusion that is integral to the artwork, and if that might be one of the distinctions between science and artwork in this view is that as you're saying, that science, there is an objective opinion is necessary, and there's a desire to make things clearer, whereas artwork, I feel, with this concealing, unconcealing, it relies on the confusion. Like, how a poem only comes to be because you're saying things in a more tangled way than you could say that in a straight sentence that doesn't have any rhythm to it or doesn't have any interesting use of language, but something would be missed in that direct clarity that does belong to the realm of science and is useful there, but maybe there's something about the nature of art that needs a sort of tangled way of viewing something, half seen, half not.